Okay. So today I want to tell you the story of the French language as a language in movement. So we all know that language is not a fixed entity, but it's mobile, it's constantly changing and adapting as the people who speak it change and the environment around them changes as well. And of course, this is as true of the French language as it is of any other language. So the kind of French that people speak changes across time, across geographical space, across social space, across context. And so the story of the French language is essentially a story of mobility. So it's a story of movement, change, and evolution. But the story of the French language is also a story of immobility. So French speakers in France have a particularly strong, what we call, ideology of the standard. So by that I mean that the notion that a standard language should exist and does exist, and that it should be adhered to very closely, that notion is particularly strong in France, and deviations from this standard are frowned upon. So everybody will be aware of institutions such as the Académie Française, which was set up to promote and protect this standard language. And the standard has a lot of prestige associated with it. And there are continual tensions between these two aspects of the French language. So on the one hand, it's constantly evolving, both in France and outside France. But on the other hand, the notion of standard French is essentially a notion of fixity. And the history of the standardization of the language is a history of attempts to fix the language in a particular unchanging form. So today I want to tell you about the French language and this constant tension between mobility and immobility, or between change and fixity. And I'm going to use the example of the development of the French language in both France and Quebec to do so. So first I'm going to talk to you a bit about the standardization of the French language and about how physical, social and linguistic mobility were central to this process, but how the outcome of the process was a sort of immobility. Then I'll be talking about how French moved to the North American continent, and in particular Canada, and about how this French developed differently from the French of France, and about the outcomes of this development. And one of the main outcomes that I'll be looking at is the impact that various types of movement and change have had on the French language in Canada in terms of French speakers' identities and also their attitudes towards the variety of French that they speak. So if we start by looking at the development of standard French, this is really central to any discussion of the French language anywhere in the world, because the process of standardization of the French language has led to French having very high prestige. And this prestige continues to play a role today anywhere where French is found in the world. So the standardization of the French language is a process that took centuries. It's still ongoing, you could say, but central to the process were different types of mobility. So physical mobility and social mobility, but also linguistic mobility. So if I just outline very briefly the main model of standardization, I can show you how this is so. So this model was developed by Einar Haugen in 1966, so that sounds really dated, but it's actually been hugely influential in studies of standardization and in the field of prescriptivism as well. So very basically, standardization involves suppressing variation and imposing a norm. And this is not just a linguistic process, it's also a social process. So Haugen's model for standardization is comprised of 4 steps, so four steps in a process, if you like: selection, codification, acceptance, and elaboration. So according to this model, the social processes of standardization are firstly selection, so where you select a dialect or a language variety to become the standard language. And then you ensure that that language is used by the whole speech community. So you ensure that it's accepted as the standard language. And the linguistic processes involve codifying the standard. So that means deciding upon its structure and explicitly laying down rules about its usage in grammars and dictionaries and so on. And also elaborating the standard where necessary. So this is to ensure that the variety that you've chosen to be the standard can function in all areas that it's needed to function in. So it might involve, for example, developing vocabulary in areas of science, or for use in education, for use in administration, and so on. So to make sure it has the vocabulary and structures necessary in order to carry out those functions. But we can actually reframe these 4 stages in terms of mobility and immobility. So the social processes, selection and acceptance, they involve change. They involve speakers adopting a new language, basically. And many of the reasons that they do so are related to mobility, social mobility, of course, but also actually physical mobility, and I'll show you how that is in just a moment. And the linguistic processes of standardization, then they also involve change initially, but then they essentially lead to fixity or immobility because they're leading to a fixed form of language, and any changes to this language are then eventually viewed very negatively. So in terms of the French language, it was during the period from the 10th to the 14th centuries, which is the period associated with Old French, that selection occurred, so the first step in the process. But even though we're talking about Old French, in fact, at this time in France, we're not talking about one language being spoken, so there were many different Romance varieties spoken at the time. And in the period between the 10th and the 12th centuries, the northern regions of France fragmented politically, and they had little contact with each other, or less contact with each other as a result of that. And so the languages that were spoken in the different regions developed independently from each other. And it was during this period that one of these local varieties was chosen to become the standard. So Francien, which was the dialect spoken in the Parisian Ile-de-France area, was selected to become the standard. And so it's during this period that we see the beginnings of standardization. So this wasn't exactly a conscious process. It's not that people sat down and said, okay, we're going to pick this variety to be our standard. It's just that for a variety of social, cultural, and political reasons, this variety, Francien, was perceived as being the best variety. And its importance was only established very slowly, so this isn't something that happened overnight, even over a period of decades. It happened over centuries. And it was largely due to the important role Paris played, in the political development of northern France. So Paris was viewed as prestigious. It was a very prosperous area. It was surrounded by fertile land. It had the river for transport. It was also the place where political power was established. It was the site of the royal court. And then intellectual and cultural factors would have played a role. So, for example, many universities and schools were founded in Paris. And of course, there was a high number of people living there, and then again it was geographically central. So for all of these reasons, Paris had a prestige which was far higher than any other northern city at the time, and so the language that was spoken there became prestigious by association. So this means that by the end of the Old French period, Francien had a kind of a special status. It was seen as the desired way to talk. And then in the period from the mid-14th to the mid-16th centuries, Francien, or French, if we like to call it, it had become by this stage the accepted norm in Paris, and it began to acquire new functions. So it began to use in new domains, it began to be used in domains where it hadn't been used before and where typically Latin would have been used before. And this is what I mean when I talk about linguistic mobility, so this moving into new linguistic domains. So as it expanded its functions, it gradually displaced these other vernaculars, and in particular, Latin. So it displaced Latin as the language of government, the language of law, the language of learning, for example. And then in 1539, the Ordonnance de Villers-Cotterêts was passed, and this states explicitly that Latin is to be replaced by the langage maternel français, so Francien, as the language that's to be used in legal and official documents. So Latin is no longer to be used in these documents. Francien, which is the language spoken by the ruling elite, the language spoken by the king, is now the only language to be used in legal and official documents. And also by the end of the 15th century, French was beginning to be used more and more as the language of literature, which of course up to that time had been Latin. So Latin, continued to exist alongside French, but French began to be used more and more, and of course the development of the printing press helped that along. And then also during this period, we begin to see the first systematic descriptions of the French language. So there was an increasing concern for codification that began to be shown just a little bit during this period. And then in the 17th and 18th centuries, This concern for codification, for noting down the rules of the language, became much more pronounced. And this was a period of really very intense activity towards codification in order essentially to suppress variation in the language and to halt change. So in order to do this, codification develops explicit rules which are laid down in prescriptive works such as guides to good usage, grammars, dictionaries, and so on. So they're setting out what's supposed to be the correct usage in terms of pronunciation, spelling, syntax, vocabulary, and so on. But at the same time, they're also identifying a group in society whose language use is held up as the desired norm. So if you see here over on the left, remarques sur la langue française. I think that's Vaugelas, but anyway, Vaugelas was one of the most famous remarqueurs of people who were writing these guides to good usage. And he very explicitly said that the language which was the best language was the language of the court. So you're very much saying these are the rules to be used, and this is the group whose rules we're following. And of course, the Académie Française was also set up during this time, so at 1635. So you can see the first edition of its dictionary there on the screen. And its aim was very overtly de donner des règles certaines à notre langue. So fixity, increasing fixity, reducing variation was one of the specific aims of the Académie Française. And then during the 18th century, already the 17th century started to be seen as some kind of golden age for the French language. So it was felt that a language of such purity and such clarity had been defined in the 17th century that the cultural elite of the 18th century could do little more than protect this language. So they couldn't seek to modify it or improve it. They needed to protect it in its perfection. And this led to a hardening of attitudes and a growing reluctance to deviate from the norms of the language as laid out in these usage guides. So it led essentially to the French language being associated with very high prestige, and that prestige is still evident today. So what this means in practical terms is that at this time, language was used as a vehicle of social mobility. And this worked in both directions. So French was used both as a means of social promotion, but also as a means of social exclusion. So basically, if you were willing, but also if you were able to adopt the linguistic usage of the elite groups, so this group's usage was seen as the desired norm, Francien, the language of the court, you could gain access to that group, or you could hope to gain access to that group and, rise in society. But if you were unable to master the usage, or if you'd no access to it, then the road to social promotion was essentially barred. And of course, at the time that we're talking about, this really was a very elite group. So the majority of the population wasn't educated or even literate. Most of them didn't have any access to this variety of French. They would have spoken a local regional group. So we're talking about a very limited group at this time, but the prestige was nonetheless there. So it was during the 18th century, the late 18th century, that the beginnings of the spread then of this elite variety to the wider population began. One important factor in the spread was the revolution. So political power was transferred to the bourgeoisie, and a notion arose that France should be unified linguistically as well as politically. So French became the symbol of Frenchness. It became seen as a necessary attribute of all true citizens of the Republic. But of course, there were practical reasons for wanting this as well. So a single language would obviously make the administration much more efficient. It would make it easier to create a single system of laws and administration within this new, highly centralized state. But the revolution on its own really wasn't enough to ensure that standard French spread across the country. Because as I said, at the time, the majority of the population spoke regional languages or dialects, and only a small minority spoke standard French. So the ideological reason for French becoming more widespread, its unifying force, and so on, wasn't enough on its own to cause the French language to spread. So other factors had to come into play. And one important factor in the spreading of the standard was the development of state education. So French primary education became available in some areas from 1794, but you still had to pay some money to access it. So a lot of people wouldn't have been able to, and then it wasn't compulsory. So a lot of people would have wanted their children to work, for example. But from the 1880s, it became compulsory and free in all areas in France, and the education was given through French. You were not allowed to use any other language. In fact, children were very harshly punished if they used another language, even in the playground. So it was very harsh. It was quite harsh punishment if they were caught using their local language. And then, of course, industrialization during the 19th century was also very important in the spread of the standard. And this is where the notion of physical mobility comes in. So because of the Industrial Revolution, transport became greatly improved. So a lot of new roads were built, of course, railways were introduced, and this led to increased freedom of movement. And so lots of people started to move out of their local area and to move away to look for work. And of course, directly related to this and to the Industrial Revolution is the fact that lots of jobs became concentrated in urban areas. So there was a lot of migration from rural to urban areas. So close-knit local communities were fragmented, and people basically couldn't speak their local dialects anymore because they wouldn't be understood. They needed to speak standard French in order to gain employment, in order to be able to communicate with people from different regions who'd also moved to cities. So in order to get on, basically, you had to start learning standard French. And then, of course, the First World War exacerbated this. So men would find themselves in troops with other men from other places, so they would need to be able to communicate, and they would use French. And this was, repeated even more so in the Second World War. So basically, all of this encouraged the spread of the standard and the decline of local languages or regional dialects. And nowadays, there are no monolinguals of local or regional languages in France. So everybody also speaks French. In fact, you have to speak French, so you couldn't get by if you just spoke a local dialect nowadays. So you can see that mobility is a really important factor in the spread of standard French, both social mobility but also physical mobility. So if you continued with the kind of fragmented, arguably nearly feudal system that existed in France or in other European countries in the past, you can see how you wouldn't necessarily need a standardized language because people would get on very well with their local language. But as soon as you start having these more modern, centralized nation states, then you begin to need to have a single common language that can be used across the state. And of course, that language needs to be standardized so that everybody across a wide geographical area can understand it. So on the one hand, you have the movement or spread of a language from a relatively small area, the area surrounding Paris, to a geographically broad area. But on the other hand, in order for that to be feasible, the language itself has to become relatively fixed or unchanging so that it can be understood by the widest number of people. So mobility leads to immobility. And in social terms, once you have this common, relatively fixed, but largely shared language, it becomes a vehicle for social mobility, and it acquires high prestige. And this association between standard French and social prestige is really important in how people view the French language in general, but also how they view their own language. So it has a really enormous influence on attitudes towards varieties of French other than the standard French of France. Because if you've one language which is perceived as being very prestigious, then naturally any other languages or language varieties with which it comes into contact are viewed then as being less prestigious. And this can affect attitudes towards these other varieties, but it can also have concrete outcomes in terms of social advancement, for example. And it plays a very important role in the attitudes towards the variety of French that's spoken in Quebec. Not only the attitudes of people within Quebec, but also the attitudes of people outside Quebec. So how does the existence of standard French and the prestige of standard French influence attitudes towards French in Quebec? So before I talk about this, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the story of French in Quebec, so I'm just going to give you a really brief overview of how it came to be spoken there. So North America was colonized by the French early in the 17th century. France founded two colonies. The first was Acadia, or Acadia, and this roughly corresponds to today's Atlantic provinces of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. If any of you have read Anne of Green Gables and you see how their attitudes towards the French speakers on Prince Edward Island, that gives you a bit of a hint at how French was viewed there. And then New France, at one time covered most of the North American continent. So you can see it goes right down as far as Louisiana. But this part of the territory here, along the banks of the St. Lawrence River, this was known as Canada. So this was the original Canada. And its population, so the French population there, called themselves Canadiens. That area now corresponds to Quebec. So over the subsequent centuries, various parts of these territories passed back and forth between the British and the French. So all these stripy red lines were contested areas. And eventually, the French surrendered both colonies to the British in the 18th century. So in 1713, it surrendered Acadia to the British by the Treaty of Utrecht. And then in 1763, New France also became a colony of the British with the Treaty of Paris. And at this time, the English-speaking population in Canada was over 1.5 million. There were 70,000 French speakers. You can see in terms of numbers, they were very much overwhelmed or at a disadvantage compared to English speakers. And this Treaty of Paris, so 1763, this was really a key moment in the history of French speaking in Canada, because at this time, there was a complete split between Canada and France. So basically, they became completely isolated from France. All links between the colony and France were basically severed at this time. So people continued to speak French as they had before. So use of French didn't change. People didn't switch to English. But you can see that they were now completely under the administration of the British. And because all of the administrators of the colony, so all of the people who essentially would have spoken standard French, at this time they all went back to France, so none of them stayed. And a lot of the teachers also went back to France. So speakers in Canada basically had very little exposure to the standard French of France. So from this period until the mid-19th century, French essentially developed in isolation. So it developed differently from the standard French of France. But because there was no contact with France, nobody was really aware of this. So nobody really thought about it much. It wasn't something that was discussed. But then in the 19th century, things changed. So since their arrival in Canada, French Canadian settlers had mainly chosen to farm, and they would have passed their land on to their sons or their children, and they basically remained very largely rural. But from around 1830 on, any sons who didn't inherit land, and of course there would have been quite a high number of these because French Canadians tended to have very large families, they found it more and more difficult to find plots of land for themselves because of the high rates of birth, there was basically no land left. And any land further to the west, so there was a lot of land available further to the west, but there was political reasons why French people didn't have access to this. So basically the administration encouraged British settlers to colonize this land further to the west, and they weren't giving any of this land or letting French speakers have any of this land. So the children of farmers who didn't inherit any land increasingly found themselves with no option but to move to cities and to look for jobs in industry. So towards the end of the 19th century, this movement of French Canadians from rural to urban locations became constant, with 50 to 80% of every generation forced to move to cities. And because the farming life of their parents, it was self-sufficient, but it was quite subsistence level, so they wouldn't have had a lot of extra money, so they wouldn't have been able to give a prolonged education to their children. So these French Canadians were arriving in cities with very little education with which to get a good job, so they were having to get jobs at the lowest level in factories. And of course, this led to a deterioration in their social position. So from having been proud independent farmers, they were reduced to taking the lowest paid jobs in industry. And then in addition to this, of course, their superiors at work were all Anglophones. So even to just get these lowest level, terribly paid jobs, they had to learn enough English to be able to communicate with their bosses, because of course the Anglophones wouldn't have been learning French. And this change in their social status eventually had a really profound effect on the collective sense of identity of French Canadians. So the political domination of the Anglo-Canadians, which had begun in the late 18th century after the French had handed over the colonies, this now became economic domination, and of course eventually that also led to social domination. And then at the same time, the French-Canadian sense of identity began more and more to be reflected by the French language, whereas in the past, the French language was only one thing amongst many which they identified with, or which they used as a symbol of their group. So factors that have been important before in their identity, things like the Catholic faith, their rural roots, their status as proud independent farmers, their religion, their orientation towards family, all of these became weakened by urbanisation. So, for example, the local priest would have a lot more influence in a small rural location than he would have in a big city. People were much more widely dispersed in cities. They didn't necessarily live closely to their family. People also started having fewer children. And all of this meant that one of the few things that was left to them to reflect their identity was the French language. And when this social and economic domination began to be felt by the French Canadians, it was the image of their language then that suffered the most. So the image they had of their language began to deteriorate at the same time as their social and economic status deteriorated. And although this began in the second half of the 19th century, it continued, so it just kept getting worse and worse until the middle of the 20th century. It just worsened over time. And one of the factors in this was that during this time, contact with France increased, and particularly between the educated classes. So it led to some of the educated elites realizing that there was a difference between the French that was spoken in Canada and the French that was spoken in France. And at the time, this didn't really bother them. It was just, oh, our French is slightly different, you know, no big deal. But then from around the 1860s, Anglo-Canadian, British and American people started to refer to this patois that was spoken by French-Canadian speakers. Note that it's not French speakers who are saying this, it's Anglophones who are saying, hey, this French isn't like the French that I heard in Paris. This is just patois, it's not proper French. So there was always this comparison with the French of France, or Parisian French, if you like. So just as an example, in 1862, Emmanuel Blanc de Saint-Aubin was employed by a lady monk to teach her children. And when she engaged him, she asked him whether he spoke Parisian French. And she said, "Je tiens à vous faire cette question quand on dit que les Canadiens français parlent un patois abominable." And this was a really widespread opinion. And so this attitude towards Canadian French began to alarm the French-Canadian elite. So their first reaction was actually to say, no, that's not true, our French is absolutely fine, what are you talking about? But nobody listened. Americans and Anglophones still kept saying, oh God, the French we speak here is terrible. So they began to feel very alarmed. And basically, they began a press campaign which was supposed to alert their fellow French Canadians to the risk that was posed by the differences between Canadian French and Standard French. So they were using the argument that if Canadian French diverged too far from the Standard French of France, it would lose all the associated prestige. And if it lost its associated prestige, people would simply stop speaking it because they already had another prestigious language right there, English. And one of the kind of factors in them being proud of their French heritage was, of course, the prestige of Standard French. And at the time, in the 19th century, French was hugely prestigious. So it was the language of diplomacy, it was the language spoken in foreign courts. I mean, much more so than it is today. I mean, it's still prestigious, obviously, in the eyes of French speakers, but in the eyes of the outside world, it was very prestigious at the time as well. So journalists and authors started writing articles and books in which they were attacking mainly Anglicisms, because Anglicisms appeared to them to be the most serious threat. Because, of course, when French Canadians moved into urban centres and had to get jobs in factories and had to learn English, of course their language, the contact between English meant that there were a lot of borrowings going into Canadian French, a lot of English borrowings. And in a lot of cases in industries, like for example the car industry, which is an example which is often given, the equivalent French terms didn't exist. there were no French terms for car parts in Canada at the time. So you'll still hear people in Canada talking about the bumper or like lots of things to do with cars. The words will still be in English. So Anglicisms were seen as a particular threat, but they were also targeting usages specific to Canadian French, things like archaisms, regionalisms, neologisms. And note that even the very term archaism shows how they were always looking back towards standard French of France, because in Canada these weren't archaisms. They've been in continual use since French Canadians had first moved to Canada, but they dropped out of use in France. So they're considered archaisms, but only by reference to the standard French of France. So the language that they were using to describe these regional usages or these Anglicisms was often extremely negative. So for example, in 1865, Arthur Bouygues was a very well-known journalist, published a series of articles in Le Pays, which is a big newspaper, where he denounced les barbarismes canadiens. And over 20 years later, so this campaign went on for quite a long time, he had a column in the newspaper, L'Électeur, which signalait un certain nombre des anglicismes et des canadianismes dont notre langue fourmille au point d'en perdre presque entièrement toute physionomie française. So he's saying that Canadian French is losing nearly all of its resemblance to the French of France. And, you know, he's clearly, when he says française, what he clearly means is the French of France. So the French of Canada is not considered to be French. And the language is really quite negative. So this kind of language is extremely common. Nous sommes infestés par l'anglicisme. L'anglicisme nous déborde, nous inonde, nous défigure et nous dénature. So there's a very negative, purist language being used to describe not only Anglicisms, but also regionalisms, archaisms, and so on. So this campaign ran for decades. It often used this kind of negative language. And the effect was that the campaign not only failed in its aim of changing the language use of French Canadians, so it had no effect on how people used language. They continued to use regionalisms, Anglicisms, archaisms. Not only did it fail in this, but what it did succeed in doing was transferring this unease that was felt by the educated elite to the wider French Canadian population. So basically it led to an even more negative attitude towards Canadian French. And this was not only on the part of Canadian French speakers, but also on the part of Anglophones. So Canadian French continued to be referred to as a patois. It continued to be compared negatively to the French spoken in France. That was seen as the only true French or the only real French. You can see this. So this is nearly 40 years later. Jules-Paul Tativel, who's another well-known journalist, also taking part in this campaign, he says, dans certains milieux, particulièrement aux États-Unis, on a eu l'impression que le français parlé au Canada n'est pas le français véritable, mais un misérable patois. This is what we refer to in this area of study as the myth of French-Canadian patois, which continues to endure across the decades in spite of this press campaign. In the early 20th century, members of rural populations were moving in ever greater numbers to urban locations and beginning to work in industry, and this exacerbated the problems that had already begun to arise in the 19th century. So awareness of the Anglo-Canadian or American accusation that French Canadians spoke this lowly patois, this became more and more widespread amongst the general French Canadian population, so we're not just talking about the elite anymore. And vocal condemnation not only of Anglicisms, but of those speakers who used Anglicisms became more and more widespread. But of course, at the same time, more and more speakers were using Anglicisms because more and more speakers were coming into daily contact with English. So this all basically led, to widening awareness amongst the general population that there was this perceived problem with the language that they spoke. So it led to decreasing confidence in their language and increasing insecurity in their language. And their opinion of their language basically worsened during the first half of the 20th century, until eventually, not only did they come to despise their own language, but they blamed themselves for having let it become contaminated. So things were at a really low point, and there was even questions about whether French would survive in Quebec. And then, you know, this increasingly negative attitude eventually reached a climax in the 1960s with what we call the querelle du joual, or maybe the joual controversy in English. Joual is a term that's used to describe Canadian French. It's often used to describe a particularly colloquial form of Canadian French. But there was basically an ongoing debate about the decline of the French language in Quebec, and it eventually led to the questioning of all aspects of the social and political organisation of French Canadians. So until this time, there hadn't been any link made between attitudes towards the French language and French Canadians' social and economic status. But for the first time in the 60s, there was this collective will to change the situation and to attack its socioeconomic and political causes, because it was finally realised that there was a link between this negative perception of Canadian French and the social and political and economic domination of French Canadian speakers. So this period is known as the period of the Quiet Revolution, la Révolution Tranquille, and it very quickly led to political demands which were addressed to the provincial Quebecois government to act in favour of the French language. And eventually it led to the creation of linguistic legislation that had very far-reaching effects on society in Quebec, and worked in favour of the French Canadian speakers in Quebec. So here you can see a banner, you know, during a protest at this time, so during the Révolution Tranquille, so tout le Québec en marche pour vivre en français. And this is really what the Quiet Revolution was all about, changing things so that French speakers in Quebec could live their lives in French and could carry out all their activities, all their daily activities in French, so they wouldn't have to have recourse to English. So there were a number of different linguistic bills, linguistic legislation, language policy bills that helped to change the language situation in Quebec, and also the social and economic standing of the Quebecois French Canadian speakers. I'm using the term French Canadian because we don't really start talking about Quebecois and Quebecois French speakers until after the 60s. So the most important of these is known as Bill 101, or the Charter of the French Language, la Charte de la Langue Française. And this aim was basically to make French the language used by everybody for everything in Quebec. And this law has actually been contested on numerous occasions. It's undergone several modifications over the years, but it has been very successful in improving the situation of Francophones in Quebec. And it's one of the main reasons that their economic situation and therefore their social situation has been turned around in the past decades. So I'm just going to give you an example of how it was successful. So obviously before this law, most of the shop fronts in Montreal would have been in English. So the signs would have been in English, you would have had to speak English to get served. So this is Schwartz's delicatessen. If you know anything about Montreal, you will know that people from Montreal are like Schwartz's Eats. Is it called Katz's in New York? You know, just Katz's for strong and right. So apparently Schwartz's smoked meat like completely beats Katz's. Anyway, this is an ongoing argument in Montreal. This was founded like in the 20s, and it's in the same place. It's still on Boulevard Saint-Laurent. So before this Charter of the French Language, it was called Schwartz's Montreal Hebrew Delicatessen. Now it's called Charcuterie Épaillée de Montréal. And that linguistic landscape, if you go to Montreal now, a lot of shop fronts will now be in French. In fact, French is now the official language of Quebec. So if you have to have all signs in French, and you can have English smaller below. So it's completely changed how the city looks. So this is just one example of many, but we're talking about mobility again here. So linguistic mobility, so the movement of the French language into domains that were previously occupied by the English language. So for example, French speakers in Quebec, particularly in Montreal, because some of the other areas remained more francophone, they can use French in work, they can go shopping in French, they can deal with administrative or bureaucratic issues in French, they can get healthcare in French, they can live their lives in French, which wouldn't have been possible in the past. And of course, it's also related to social mobility, because French Canadian speakers have been able to move up the social scale now that they can access better jobs in their own language. So you see that there's lots of types of mobility that can affect language use. So any major physical movement of people, be that from a village to an urban setting or across an ocean, that can affect language use, so it can lead to changes in language use. So in the case of Quebec, initially the movement of speakers from France to Quebec led to differences in the French spoken in Quebec, so developed differently from the French spoken in France. And later on, the movement of French speakers from rural to urban locations changed their way of life and changed the way that they used their language. And in particular, their languages became relegated to the home, whereas before they would have used it for all aspects of their daily life. And of course, the French that they spoke was also influenced very heavily by the English language, so a lot of borrowing took place. And then, of course, we're talking about linguistic mobility because languages can move in and out of various domains. So I've just given an example of that. Before urbanisation, French Canadians living in cities would have really seen use of French relegated to the home, whereas now it's moved back into lots of other domains. Shopping, administration, hospitals, and so on. And this, of course, also happened following standardization of French in France. So the French language moved into domains that had previously been occupied by Latin. And then, of course, we're talking about social mobility. So changes in social status, either up or down, are reflected in attitudes towards the language that speakers use. So as the social standing of a group goes down, generally attitudes towards that language also become more negative, as we've just seen in Quebec. And as the social standing of a group goes up, then we'd expect attitudes towards speakers of that language to also go up. So if you think about the spread of standard French, the speakers of Français initially were regarded as being socially superior, and so people wanted to speak their language. So if Bill 101 brought about an improvement in the social and economic status of French Canadian speakers, we would expect to see a related improvement in their attitudes towards their language. So we expect to see attitudes towards their language become more positive. And recent research would suggest that this is indeed the case. So although French speakers in Quebec remain concerned about the use of English and Anglicism, so this is really understandable given that they're surrounded by millions of English speakers, they've lost much of the linguistic insecurity that they felt about their variety of French, so about the variety of French that they use, and about the use of regionalisms and archaisms and so on. And this has been made quite clear by research that I've carried out on attitudes towards French in Quebec. I haven't got time to give you more than a brief example today, but in 2010 I carried out an interview study on attitudes towards the French language in France and Quebec. Interviews were carried out with a total of 36 respondents in both France and Quebec, so 72 respondents in total, and the sample populations had a balanced distribution in terms of sex, age and education. So I looked at lots of different things in this study, but one of the things I looked at was perceptions of French that speakers have in either place. And one of the questions I asked was, when respondents thought that the best French, in inverted commas, was spoken. And far more French respondents referred to the 17th century and the 18th century and to les grands états. So when I was talking to you about how French became standardized, I was saying this kind of notion arose that the best French was kind of crystallized in the 17th century and that we shouldn't change it because it had been so perfect at that time, as embodied in the writings of people like Molière. So 45% of French respondents referred to this compared to less than 20% of Quebecois respondents. So they were saying things like, the best French is spoken in the 17th century, c'est l'époque de Corneille, de Molière et tout ça. Je pense que c'est quand on arrive vers Molière, le 17e siècle, Molière, Racine et tous les grands états. Quebec respondents were more likely to claim that contemporary or modern French is the best French. And French respondents didn't really refer to this at all. So they didn't say the French we speak now is the best French. So Québécois respondents said things like, je pense qu'on parle un meilleur français international maintenant qu'il y a 40 ans. Le niveau de langage utilisé aujourd'hui est bien meilleur. And This is really something that if Quebecois speakers were still looking towards the French of France as their yardstick or as their standard, we might expect them to reflect this 17th century notion, perhaps, but even if we didn't, we wouldn't expect them to be saying the French that we speak here now is the best French, because if you were insecure about the language that you spoke, that's not the kind of comment that you'd be making. And I also think a really important term in terms of attitudes towards French in Quebec now is le Français international. So Quebec respondents talk about this variety of French a lot, and they refer to it as a valid counterpart to the standard French of France. So they're saying, yes, we speak a different form of French, but it's just as valid. It's le Français international. It's not just us who speak it, other countries, other Francophone countries speak it. It's a widely recognized and understood variety of French. Interestingly, it's not written down anywhere. There's no usage guides. It's something that exists in speakers' heads. So most grammar books and so on are still very much based on the standard French of France. But no one in Quebec would say, oh no, I speak the standard French of France. In fact, it would be seen as somewhat negative, for example, to try and use a Parisian or standard French of France accent now. It's the variety used on Radio-Canada, so people often also refer to it as le Français Radio-Canada. They're the two terms they'll use when they're talking to you about this variety. So it has prestige. In the past, announcers on Radio-Canada would have spoken a very standard form of French, akin to the standard French of France, but nowadays that's no longer the case. So local accents are now acceptable on Radio-Canada. Of course, we're talking about a particular type of local accent. In the same way nowadays on the BBC, you might hear someone with a Welsh accent, but it's not going to be a very broad, it's still going to be, widely understood, but it's certainly got a local flavour. So this is given prestige to this language, of course, and it's obviously a massive change from before Bill 101, when the French language spoken in Quebec really wasn't viewed as being acceptable either by French speakers in Quebec or by outsiders. So we can see that the French spoken in Canada has moved on considerably since its original journey across the Atlantic in the 17th century. It's undergone linguistic changes and social changes in terms of its prestige and the social status of its speakers. But whereas in the past, Quebecois speakers were continually looking back to the standard French of France, this no longer really seems to be the case. So this is, of course, due to the reversal of the fate of the French language that came about after the implementation of these far-reaching linguistic laws, which culminated in Bill 101, or the Charte de la langue française. But it seems that in Quebec, this tension between mobility and immobility that we see in France, due to the reverence for the standard language that still exists in France, seems that this is more relaxed now in Quebec. So change isn't necessarily seen as a negative thing in Quebec to be stopped at any cost, but it seems to be an integral part of the identity of Quebecois speakers today. Okay, we're back on 50 minutes, so I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. That was really interesting.